You're all very welcome to our webinar today, Adult Literacy and Addressing Inequality in Ireland. This is the third year of our Literacy Open Doors series. We started this back in 2023, specifically for people working and volunteering in the community and voluntary sector. We wanted to give people that opportunity to explore different themes around literacy and showcase the brilliant work going on across the sector. And because you're on the ground providing support and you're really trusted in communities, you're really in that unique position, I suppose, to champion literacy and be a support when people might be nervous or embarrassed. I suppose today it's good to keep in mind when we talk about literacy in NALA, we mean reading and understanding text, using everyday numbers, like working out a 20% discount in a shop or dividing up a bill in a restaurant. We also consider listening and speaking all part of literacy, how comfortable we might be asking questions, communicating day to day. And we've learned over this 40 years of NALA that confidence is really the key ingredient for strong adult literacy. Often people who are very nervous about the reading and writing, they actually might have more than they think they do, but the confidence piece is what's a huge barrier. It's not black and white, you know, it's not all or nothing. This is why in NALA we don't use literate, illiterate. We don't use that language because it just doesn't reflect the reality of our literacy skills that develop and ebb and flow over our lifetime. So we often use the term you'll hear today, unmet literacy skills. And this means for us, it's not about the individual, it's about what maybe didn't happen for them when they were younger. It's about the system. Their needs weren't met at some point along their learning or education journey. And that's maybe why as an adult, they struggle with some of these tasks. So we're trying to flip, I suppose, where the root causes and the factors behind adult literacy are in Ireland. Like I said, we ebb and flow in our literacy. We have spiky profiles. We might be better at reading, more confident at reading than we are at writing or spelling. And people sometimes can develop very strong literacy in one particular area because maybe it's their routine, their job, their everyday, and then they come into a new space, possibly healthcare, with a lot of stress, maybe and anxiety, and then things get a bit more difficult for them. So it's important to keep that in mind when we talk about literacy. All that change and the context matters so much. We always talk about, you know, a beginner reader is not a beginner thinker, and that's really important. You know, literacy and education attainment is not linked to intelligence. Many people are incredibly intelligent, yet they weren't always given the opportunity to experience their education. So today it's all about understanding the context around adult literacy in Ireland. Last December, the OECD published statistics on a research study, adult literacy skills study, and this gave us an up-to-date picture of reading levels in Ireland. It's very, very interesting, and we're delighted that our Research and Policy Office, the Aoife Crawford, can kind of show us what those statistics tell us about today. And they do reveal things about intergenerational legacies of poverty and inequality in Ireland that really still have their lasting impact here. We also have the wonderful David Joyce from Further and Higher Education Coordinator in Pavee Point. Pavee Point have spoken at many webinars before, and we're delighted they could be here today. If you don't know, Pavee Point is a traveller and Roma centre, and they take a community development approach to address traveller and Roma issues, including education, housing, health and addiction. And as you all know, everyone's very busy, so we really appreciate our speakers being able to be with us today and you all in attendance. So I'm going to pass over now to Aoife. I'll just stop my screen share there, Aoife, so you can hop on.
Thank you so much, Derv. It's good to be here. Just everybody bear with me for 2 seconds while I get my PowerPoint going. Yeah. Everyone can see the slides, yeah? Great. Okay, listen, thank you, Derv, so much for the introduction, and good to be here. So I am going to be talking about that piece of research that Derv mentioned in particular, the OECD survey of adult skills. So just jump right into it. So this is the latest piece of research that we have on what the kind of level of literacy and numeracy needs are in Ireland today. So it's really, really important and really useful for us in getting a picture of what is happening out there. So the survey of adult skills, what do they mean by survey? There's a questionnaire is the first thing, so you actually get quite a lot of information about the people who are taking the test, and there's actually an assessment. So what's great about this is it's assessing people's actual skills, as opposed to, as Derv mentioned, sometimes people can be a bit unconfident and they might say, oh, I have terrible reading. but actually they're quite good, etc. So this is like a real, like this is very accurate. Um, it covers adults between the ages of 16 and 65. So just to bear that in mind, it doesn't actually cover older adults beyond that. Um, and the skills it measures are literacy, by which we mean reading and understanding text in this context. Numeracy, essentially your maths, using numbers day to day. And this thing called adaptive problem solving, which we're not really going to get into today, but if anybody's very curious, ask me about it afterwards. So again, if you're keen to learn more about this, these links here will take you to kind of more information about the survey, how it's run. At the international level, it's run by the OECD, so the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. This group of primarily kind of rich Western countries, 31 of them took part in this. It's also known as PIAC. Anybody who's kind of in the biz of literacy might have heard it referred to as PIAC. It's the same thing. In Ireland, it's run by the CSO, so you can find kind of the full results for Ireland there. But today, we're really going to be focusing on kind of what came out of the survey as regards like literacy needs. So in this survey, the scores are grouped into 5 levels, right? There's levels 1 to 5. And just to say, anyone maybe who's working in an ETB or something or adult education will be thinking of levels 1 to 10 on that kind of like QQI or the National Framework of Qualifications scale. So when we say level 1 for this, it's a different thing. So that there's 5 levels, not 10, and essentially roughly speaking, you could perhaps say that like a level 1 in this corresponds roughly to a level 1 or 2 on the NFQ, but it's not the same thing. So just to flag that. So if somebody scores at or below level 1 in this assessment, we would refer to them as having, as Sarah said, literacy or numeracy needs. So how many people or adults in Ireland came out of this survey in 2023 with literacy needs? It was 21%. Which is around 1 in 5 adults in Ireland. And based on the 2022 census, it's around 700,000 adults, probably slightly more now because the population continues to grow. And for numeracy then, situation is slightly worse. 25% of adults have numeracy needs. That's 1 in 4, or around 835,000 adults. So we do find that like these figures are probably a good bit higher than sometimes people maybe think. I know we're quite rightly proud in Ireland of all kinds of like improvements in our education system over the like recent decades, but there still is quite a lot of people out there who do kind of have these needs. And in particular, as well, just wanted to flag that. So those headline figures are kind of like the overall, like the average for all the adults, but we do see sort of these patterns of inequality across different groups. So these are just a few examples of kind of some of the really starkest figures that came out of the survey, but there's lots more that they looked at. So looking at literacy, 21% of adults have literacy needs, but 33% of 55 to 65-year-olds. So that's the oldest cohort that were actually assessed. And as you see there, yeah, they're like quite significantly more likely to have literacy needs. It's the same across maybe some different kind of employment sectors. So work, transportation and storage have the highest levels of literacy needs at 35%. Again, around 1 in 3 people working in that area would have these needs. And a really big one is around education and like educational inequality. So if you don't have upper secondary education, so you're talking like leaving certificate or a post-leaving certificate, a PLC, you're even more likely again, 61% of adults without upper secondary do have literacy needs. So I suppose to flag that even within the 21%, which might be higher than some people realize, there's also these kind of patterns where certain groups or people who've had certain circumstances in their lives or their certain life stages are even more likely again. So I suppose I would also flag just at this point, especially given Pavee Pointer speaking later, that unfortunately the background questionnaire in the survey doesn't cover absolutely everything. So for example, like we don't know kind of, there aren't specific figures for the traveller community. Disability wasn't covered by the CSO. We are going to be looking into it next year, hopefully. And also, I suppose the flag there are some kind of factors that we might intuitively think are going to make a big difference, or that we might particularly be interested in, but they don't actually hugely. So for example, like gender and country of birth, so whether someone's immigration status, essentially actually don't make a huge amount of difference. The biggest factors really are around age and around factors to do with education. And not to depress everybody, but I do think this is such an important finding in particular that's not even just about your own education, it's about the educational experience of your parents, and how these kind of cycles kind of carry on, unfortunately, from generation to generation. So I hope people don't mind. I do love graph. The purple there is literacy, the orange is numeracy. You can see that they're very similar, to be honest, across all different levels. The really key thing is the fact that this graph kind of slants down. So if at the left there, if your parents don't have the upper secondary, okay, they don't have a Leavens or a PLC, there's quite high levels of literacy needs among their children. And then that kind of falls as you go down until you get to, like, if your parents have third level, okay, so they went to college, you're much less likely to have these needs. But interestingly, of course, still you've got 10% of people whose parents went to college do have literacy needs as well. So I think another point to make is, while we draw attention to these patterns of inequality, also these can affect absolutely everybody across our society. So in terms of this survey, what do the OECD mean by literacy needs? I mean, it's important to mention, and I did touch on this earlier as well, like that most adults with literacy needs can like, they do have a certain level of skills and they can understand and find information in short and simple texts. But I've underlined the most because, in fairness, a good proportion, like about a third of that 21%, can't. So there still are people obviously who have different levels of need, and they'll have sort of like better skills in certain areas than others, etc. I suppose the issue is it's this intersection of the maybe like the needs that the person has themselves, and also the the literacy demands of everyday life, which, as we all know, are just getting higher and higher. Like, it's very hard now to just go and to have any job, for example, where there isn't requirements for all kinds of quite complicated literacy tasks. So for example, and some of these examples come from a piece of work that we were delighted to do with the Wheel last year, around literacy in the community voluntary sector. And so some of these came out, like Garda vetting forms quite strongly as something that people find very stressful. But if you think even just day-to-day emails that we all are writing to each other all the time, sort of picking up the phone, understanding big long policy documents in your workplace, and indeed, yes, the Garda vetting forms. So just supposed to think about how, yeah, these things interact. It's the person and it's the environment. Similarly with numeracy, okay, most adults who, like that 1 in 4 who have numeracy needs, can do maybe a basic calculation, maybe that has just one step in it. But of course, most calculations that you have to do are not like basic or single step. It's not like 2 + 2, there you go, sorted. It's much more complicated in daily life. So if you think about like budgeting in your personal life or in your work, you think like claiming expenses with another one again from that piece of research with the Wheel about like the complexity of that, and then you're out of pocket because you don't understand how the system works and it's taking you ages to work through it, or you're doing it wrong and getting it sent back to you. Or things like journey planning, you think like managing a timetable, working out putting all the different factors together. So those are just a few examples, but I'm sure people on this call will have more that you've come across in your work. So can I spend a little bit of time on this one, because I think this is probably the most important slide I have today. So we've got this 1 in 5 and this 1 in 4 adults and higher levels across different groups who have literacy and numeracy needs. Well, what does that mean? Like, what kind of impact does that actually have then on their day-to-day lives? So the graphic here is really just to give a sense of like these are some of the domains of areas that like literacy, numeracy, and digital can touch. Unfortunately, the OECD research we're talking about today did not cover digital, otherwise I'd be talking about it. But typically, digital literacy needs are higher than literacy and numeracy. Just leave that there. But yeah, the OECD research did find that people who have these literacy and numeracy needs are, like, provably more likely to have poor health, to have low income or to be unemployed. And they are less likely to have high life satisfaction, to be very satisfied with life, to trust others, to believe that they have a say in what the government does, or to, ironically, and we'll come on to this next, take part in adult learning. So I'd be really interested to hear from people, whether in the chat or if you want to unmute, that's cool. As to I suppose why you think this is. Like, why is there this connection, like between, for example, like literacy and health? What's that all about? So if there's any of those areas that kind of jump out at you as being kind of important, or you're thinking, oh yeah, yeah, I know a bit about that. If you want to like pick one and be like, okay, why would numeracy affect employment, for example? I'm just really interested to see people's thoughts in the chat. And I'm going to try and see if I can see it because I've gone into presenter mode. I actually can't see the chat right now.
I can read it out for you, Aoife.
Cool, thanks, Surf.
There's a couple of comments here, shame and low self-esteem connected.
Major across the board there. Yeah, absolutely. Like not having the confidence to kind of like put yourself out there to kind of cross the threshold into different scenarios. Yeah, can hold you back. Yeah.
And that's exactly the next two comments. So confidence to engage or advocate for yourself is difficult. And lack of confidence or being constantly told that you're not good enough.
Yes, that confidence message is coming across really strongly. Yeah, yeah, dead right as well. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'll whitter on in case there's any more coming in, but I suppose the one about having a say in government has been, I think, of maybe of particular interest. They're all important, of course, like, but when you just think about things like we're kind of concerned at the minute about like social cohesion, and falling turnouts in elections, this kind of thing. So it's really, yeah, that's really important. The Electoral Commission have been great and been doing some work with us on trying to make the electoral process more welcoming. There's a confidence piece there about like thinking, well, what I have to say or what I think matters. But also, I mean, there's also things around the complexity of these things, like, you know, how the whole voting systems work, like making sure you're on the register properly, understanding your, what you call it, the polling card, going to the right place. Go like when you go in and you know there's a big list of like all the different like streets in your area and you have to go pick the right desk and there's definitely an embarrassment factor there. Maybe there aren't people necessarily who understand about literacy needs in the centre ready to help you, etc. I'm sure there are sometimes, but and then God, I mean the whole system itself, you know, or the 1, 2, 3, 4 ordering and having to read a big long piece of paper in order
There's
to
a
cast
few
your
more
vote.
comments there, Aoife.
Right.
We have health in terms of the amount of appointments, letter forms to fill out when, especially when you fear discrimination for migrants.
Yeah.
Parents mistrusting the system. And then health, a lack of knowledge due to lack of opportunity to learn. Not being able to find out even about services or apply for them. And then the last comment there is residual effects of negative experience in education, the trauma effects on self-confident mental health, affecting your ability to self-advocate. Oh, we've still more. This is great.
Great.
Engagement. Yeah, like you had mentioned, the literacy required for any job now, even maybe ones that would have been easier to get into. Yeah, and it can act as a deterrent for entry into employment in general or a workplace. And then, yes, people are nervous about disclosing then in the workplace when they need support or different accommodations. And yeah, this is interesting. People might identify themselves as dyslexic rather, even if they're not quite sure, but just because it feels maybe an easier way to talk about literacy needs. And then people feeling excluded and overwhelmed. Yeah. If something happens like a death or dealing with finances and things. Yeah. So great everybody for those.
Great inputs. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah. 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 I think we've got a very understanding audience. I think, yeah, really get what this is all about. Okay. So we could talk about this forever, but I will move on. Just to mention, okay, so one way by which kind of the needs can be addressed is the two sides of it. That's kind of making our world more like the literacy friendly, kind of reducing unnecessary kind of barriers, and that unnecessary complexity on forms, for example. But the other end of it, of course, is kind of empowering people, kind of like work on their own skills. But sadly, what we see is an example of what is called the Matthew effect, essentially where those who kind of already have get more, those who really don't have so much get less. And this has been applied to education in very many different ways, but it definitely applies here to adult literacy. So this is the last chart. On your left, you have, this is the adult learning rates of adults who have level 4 and above on that literacy scale. So they're already kind of got like very high levels of literacy skills. They're very confident in their reading. And this is from the same OECD research, by the way. And then that falls down as you kind of go down the levels until you got kind of the level 1 and below, and that's like 32% are participating in, and that's in any kind of adult learning. So that's kind of essentially like you could be doing a master's, you could be doing a kind of diploma outside work, you could be in an adult literacy class, you could be in some kind of any kind of like creative learning and community education. You could be doing like workplace training. It's very, very broad in fairness. But it definitely the picture is very clear. That essentially kind of like the more skills you already have, the more likely you are to be kind of engaging in education. Perhaps because of some of those things a lot of people have mentioned around kind of like the confidence piece, around kind of maybe your experiences to date of education have been positive, so you're more likely to kind of like want to go back into education, etc. Whereas if your experiences have been maybe more negative, you've faced barriers before, why would you be pushing yourself to go back in? It's so it's a challenge. Most people would say. But it's a challenge that like the OECD does recognize, which is great to see. Like they have said in their policy brief attached to this adult learning report, that, like without deliberate coordinated policy action, adult learning reinforces advantage rather than leveling the playing field. And you absolutely see that. And this is the rates for Ireland, by the way. Yeah, we see it time and again. So what are some of the barriers? Again, this is from the same OECD report on adult learning. For adults, of course, finding the time. Of course, it's a major one. Childcare, and interestingly, this one was particularly high in Ireland compared to other countries. Perhaps unsurprisingly, considering the expense of childcare in Ireland. But anyway, that's a separate soapbox. And cost as well. And those, in fairness, are just to say that's across kind of all adults in all countries who took part in this. Those are just the general kind of barriers people might face. But it has an impact, when people are supported and facilitated to go and engage in adult literacy learning, or adult learning of any kind. It really does have a lot of positive impacts. And these are just a few. I just took this because I wanted to have a reference from AINTIS's great work on learner voices. They do an annual like learner voices for adult learners across Ireland every year. And their last one really highlighted the factors of confidence, belonging, and well-being. And this quote across has come from a report on our own Learn with NALA online learning system, which kind of, we see that as well. It really reinforces that. This person saying, it's given me great confidence. I felt I was doing something for myself as I fell through the cracks in school. So that's, yeah, I think it speaks for itself. I suppose is to say there are, of course, many other barriers and many possible impacts, which I'm sure people like are probably running through their mind right now. This is just a selection from these reports, but like it has all kinds of positive benefits for people. If you think about those impacts we talked about earlier, we were looking at it in the negative way, but the positive thing is that like kind of once you kind of go up, improve your literacy skills, that can really open doors. So just to say, if you're interested in kind of more of the detail around the figures and things that I've been talking about today, we have a series of 5 fact sheets, and you can access them at that link. I'm really happy. I'm so interested in all this. Really happy to talk about this anytime with anybody here. That is my email address there, acrawford@nala.ie. So yeah, thanks so much for all being so engaged.
Thanks, Aoife. That was amazing. Really, really interesting to get, underneath some of the stats. That study that Aoife just shared all those things from, it is enormous and highly complex. So Aoife has worked really hard to draw out the detail of that, and we really appreciate it because I couldn't look at the raw data if you saw it. It is very overwhelming. So it's a huge job to be able to communicate it to all of us. And so really appreciate that, Aoife. Thank you so much. So I'm going to pass over to David now, and then at the end there'll be questions. But if you do have anything in your mind and you just want to get it out, like pop it in the chat, or later you can say it on the mic. And I'm going to be sharing David's slides, so just let me set that up. If I do this right. Okay. Can everybody see those okay? And David, yeah, when you want me to change, you just let me know and I'll switch to the next one.
Yeah, no problem. Just want to start by saying thanks to Aoife. That was a wonderful presentation. Thanks to her for having us here this morning. To be honest with you, what's coming out of that research is kind of like what we didn't even know it was research. So it's going to look like we were working together, but we weren't. I can guarantee that. Because I think when you want to understand like unmet literacy needs with a marginalized community, you kind of have to look at the wider and bigger picture. So, and that is kind of deep of what Pavee Point does, is that we're not a service provider. We do work at a national level. And I suppose importantly, we work with travelers in Roma communities rather than work or speak on behalf of them. But a lot of that time does mean we have to get information out. And while we would like to improve or to kind of improve programmatic development that would meet the literacy needs of both communities. But the reality is that we live in a reality where there is critical information that has to get out there at this moment in time that has to be done in a way that is appropriate for the literacy levels of people who are currently living in the current world. So with that, can we just go to the next slide there, please? Thanks, Derv. So I'll just start with who we are, what we do, and then I'll go a bit of an overview of travelers and then some of the issues that travelers actually, and we are focusing on travelers today, even though we do work with travelers in Roma, but some of the issues that travelers face in contemporary Ireland. And the other thing I just want to kind of note is that I was supposed to have a colleague with me this morning. Unfortunately, she was ill and she works a lot on the ground and with the dissemination of information. So I might not be quite as good at getting that kind of practice across, but I'll do my best. So who are Pavee Point? So we are a national organization or a non-governmental organization committed to the attainment of human rights for travellers in Roma. We do this through research, policy development, advocacy, and collective community action. And I suppose when you look at the graph at the side, it really kind of captures it. We do it through a community development approach. That means we do it through collectivity, community empowerment, social justice and sustainable development, human rights, equality, on the principles of human rights, equality, and anti-discrimination. And here's the key part, it's participation. We don't work on behalf of the community, we don't work for the community, we work with the community. And that kind of leads with everything that we do. So, you know, we were founded, as I said, in 1985. We were actually founded as an education group. So I can't remember, it's a really long acronym, which, you know, is not great in kind of a literacy context, but it was the Dublin, it's gone from my head, but it started off as an education group in 1985, originally in Mead Street, in just south of Aoife. Then we got the current premises in Mount Joyce Square in 1988, and we changed the name to Pavee Point soon after our foundation. So our policy work, so we work at a national and international level, and our policy work has been represented at European levels, including, but not limited to, the European Union, the United Nations, and the Council of Europe. But there's also been a lot of work here in Ireland with government departments. So next slide, please. So who are travellers? And so this is just a quick statistical profile, and you know, it doesn't really capture what we are as a population, but there is approximately 40,000 travellers on the island of Ireland, and the All Ireland Health Study in 2010 captured 36,000 in the Republic and a further 4,000 in the north. The 2022 census captured 33,000. Now, there are a number of reasons why there might be underreporting. We actually might figure that, you know, unofficially the figures might be as high as 60,000. However, you know, and it comes back to literacy, but it also comes back to kind of trust in the system and trust in kind of filling out a government form, that people do underreport, because all of these figures are based on self identification. Travellers are a recognised ethnic minority group. This was acknowledged by then An Taoiseach Enda Kenny on the 1st of March 2017. It was, I think, a culmination of a 20 years campaign to see the recognition of travellers well, a 30-year campaign to see the recognition of travellers as a separate ethnic group. Travellers are defined by a nomadic way of life. However, it's very important to know that not all travellers are nomadic. That doesn't make them less of a traveller. So while nomadism was central to the community, you know, there are issues now around stuff, you know, you might refer to, how can you be a traveller? You live in a house. How can you be a traveller? You're settled. And in many ways, I personally consider the term settled traveller as offensive as a term as a lot of them. Other parts of the culture does include the keeping of horses. Horses are really, really crucial part and kind of a central part to the community's identity and how it sees itself, and the keeping of them and the care of horses. So languages, you know, commonly referred to as Cant, linguistically referred to as Shelta and Gammon. A lot of Cant words have made their way into Irish slang. You might recognize a few, you know, words like Bure for woman, Fiend for man. A lot of these have, like I said, gone in, particularly in the south and in Munster, like whether Limerick or Cork, have made their way into what would be considered slang, but actually is a part of an older language that's kind of more closely related to Shangailga than anything else. The community has strong values built around close and extended family. You know, you might hear the term, it takes a village to raise a child, and that's nowhere truer than in the traveller community, where, you know, extended family is almost, it's not really based on the nuclear family system. The extended family is far more important, I would say, within the traveller community than it can be sometimes in the settled community. Now, I do know that, you know, you can't tar everyone with one brush, and different families are different, but particularly in our community, that whole idea that, you know, it's just you, it's just the parents, it's just the kids. It's not. It's the wider family. Is super important for travellers. Strong faith. You know, though this doesn't really, this is not one that's applicable to me, but travellers do tend to have a strong faith and to be quite religious. And that's when you're nomadic, when you are a nomadic culture, or when you're coming from that kind of tradition of nomadism. Usually celebrations such as christenings, communions, confirmations, weddings, and particularly funerals were times where you could come together. You know, where you've been on, when you'd been on the road, you're coming back, you're meeting up for the first time in a long time. So that was quite. So these are one of the reasons why these are quite important. And then art. Travellers do actually have a rich tradition of art, and that includes a rich oral literary tradition. Unfortunately, as we're going to learn, due to bad experiences of school, unmet literacy needs are very, very common in the traveling community. But, you know, we have musicians, we do have artists, and even the kind of wagon making, but also wagons as an expression of art in and of themselves. And then you have tinsmitten or whitesmitten. I actually have a tinsmitten cup just above my head there, as you can see. So these were kind of the traditional industries of the community, but were also kind of expressions of art. Next slide, please. Sorry. So the challenges faced by travellers, even today, do include racism and discrimination. You know, we are probably, I would say, travellers are very heavily discriminated against in kind of all factors of Irish society. There is a lot of work being done on this, and you know, there have been changes, but in general, travellers are quite strongly marginalised within kind of even from access to services through education or through employment. You know, and that leads on to what Aoife was saying earlier on. That leads to a lot of unmet literacy needs, you know, and then negative experiences with education services, and particularly kind of a phenomenon of intergenerational trauma with education services that has to be kind of addressed, and is, to be fair to the government, is being addressed at the moment. There are issues then around lack of access to mainstream supports and services in healthcare, in employment supports, and like again in education. There are issues around addiction, homelessness, and there's specific challenges then for traveller women, LGBTQI, and travellers with a disability. Next slide, please. So I think getting into kind of the bones of why literacy and unmet literacy needs have such an impact for travellers is, you kind of have to look at three key factors, though there is more if you look at if you look at accommodation. But I'm just going to focus today on education, employment, and health. So the proportion of travellers enrolled in DEIS schools is 60% of total traveller pupils, and this is DEIS reporting themselves, Department of reporting themselves in 2023. Less than 2% of travellers have completed a third or higher education qualification. 28% of travellers do leave school before the age of 13 compared to 1% of non-school leavers. And even of that 82% who go on to higher secondary education, only 30% of them end up going on to leaving cert. You know, upper secondary school, it came up in the previous report, and then only 10% or so actually end up sitting the leaving cert. This obviously impacts employment. You know, the unemployment rate for travellers from 15 to 65 years is 61%, and versus the national average of 5%. For females, they are slightly more likely to be employed than men, who are 63%, but still the majority, and I think that's a significant majority of both genders, are more likely to be unemployed. Next slide, please. So health, and I suppose this is where it was after this slide I was going to hand over to Mary Bridget, so I'm going to try to do my best to kind of fill in for what she does. But, you know, why is literacy so important for travellers? And, you know, we understand why, the reasons that there's a lot of unmet literacy needs, but health is a great example as to why we need to get information out and why information is so important. And that means working around unmet literacy needs. Infant mortality for travellers is 4 times higher. It's 4 times higher than the general population. Suicide rates are 6 times higher, and that's an average between men and women, because they're 4 times higher for women, and they're 8 times higher for men. But they account for 1 in 10 traveller deaths. 89% of travellers are under 50, and only 3% of travellers reach the age of 65. In fact, when the All Ireland Health Study was carried out in 2010, there was only 3 travellers who were over the age of 85 in the country. Our mortality is 3.5 times higher, and we live on average 13.3 years less than non-travellers. And again, this is an average. Women live 10 years less, and men live 15 years less than the general population, than their settled counterparts. Travellers under the age of 15 account for 42% of the traveller population, and less than 3% of our population is over the age of 65. Now, I took this table out of the All Ireland Health Study itself, because it kind of really shows the impact of literacy on health. So when they were asked, and it goes back to what Aoife was saying again, that, you know, simple information can make a huge impact. But when they were asked, could they read forms, 71% of travellers actually said yes, they could. And then when you look at those who can read and fill out forms, can they do them but with difficulty, that was 13%. And then I'm not going to go into the numeracy, but when you go into of those who take prescriptions, when it actually comes to reading the prescriptions, the difficulty of understanding then shot up to 50%. So it's so important in terms of health. But when we look wider than health, then we look into education, and I don't have slides for this, but, you know, travellers are 8 times more likely to receive reduced school days on average over the last 3 years. And that actually requires the consent of the parents to put travellers on reduced school days. However, are the parents truly understanding what they are consenting to in that? So, you know, a lot of these kind of official forms of communication can be quite jargony, and they can be quite, you know, complex. So with that, we'll go on to the next slide, please. So how we work around this. So disseminating information for unmet literacy needs. I suppose the first thing we do, and it's why we went through the last couple of slides, is that we have to understand the impact that racism and discrimination has on the community. And with that, we have to avoid a one size, and the next two work together, that kind of one size fits all approach. But we also have to be aware of stereotypes and prejudices and avoid them. Then we have to consider the unmet literacy needs and how we address those. And then, you know, particularly when it comes to the primary healthcare team, like I said, I was handing over to Mary Bridget here. We have to give a clear explanation of what the role of the primary healthcare worker is, how they work, and then build trust with the community by true consistency. We use multimodal forms of communication. You know, that I said avoid jargon, so I'll avoid it here. Multimodal forms, so different forms of communication. Sometimes it's plain English. We use iconography, images, you know, different colors, kind of, you know, it'll be sometimes it's actually talks, or it can be voice notes or short, quick videos on information. Like I said before, we use plain English and avoid jargon. And I suppose what it really boils down to is meeting people where they are at. And that means while we would like to see an improvement in literacy in the community, that the reality is what it is, and we have to meet. We have to meet and get that information out there at this moment in time. Next slide, please, Derv. So here's an example of what the kind of information that the primary healthcare team might get out. And just actually, I'm just going to go to it back because I couldn't actually find a copy of it because it was 15 years ago. But the All Ireland Health Study was carried out in 2010. And at the time, there was a lot of kind of rumination about the literacy needs, particularly when people, how are we going to get this out when people need to fill out the survey? And what the primary healthcare team came up with, again, I couldn't find the examples, but I will try to find them and incorporate them into the slide before Derv shares them. What they came up with on a pad was pictures, icons that, if it came to like access to clean water, it was literally, a tap, no water, nothing coming out of it, water, clean water, blue water, and then a tap with brown water for access to dirty water. So that was meeting the community where they're at. Obviously, there was still, the question was still written out in English, in plain English and in plain simple language, but it was that kind of, innovative at the time. I wasn't in Pavee Point at the time, but that kind of innovative approach to, we need this information to improve things for the future for this research. So to find a solution. And I think this kind of really checks there for the primary healthcare program. They do use stuff like this, like, you have a bowel cancer screening, but the picture is there. And then obviously if the primary healthcare worker is out in the community, they'll also be explaining what they mean by that. And they try to make it as simple as possible for the community to kind of get that information across. And there is a huge, and again, we're focusing on health because there is such a huge need when it comes to around health, healthcare issues with travellers in the community. Next slide, please, Derv. And here's some kind of further examples of the kind of the literature we put out there. So usually what happens is, whether it's ourselves on the education program or whether it's the healthcare program, and that's split into primary healthcare and mental health. Information will come out from either the statutory body, the government agency, or the department itself. And we tend to put it through a process of, okay, this is a very, very crucial information. How do we simplify this? And I don't like that sense patronizing, because that's actually something I suppose in the good practice, don't be patronizing, respect people's intelligence, but while at the same time meeting their literacy needs. But how do we clarify the message would be the best way to put it. How do we make the message understandable for people who do have unmet literacy needs? And I think this one here in the corner, the breast cancer awareness one, was actually awarded by NALA, an award back in 2019. And we still actually use it today because it's so, we don't want to reinvent the wheel, and if it's not broken, don't fix it. But it's, as you can see, it's a mixture of just very, 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 very simple. It's not too jargony. There's not a lot of words, but what the words are there get straight to the point. It's straight to the point. It's simple, but it's using images and iconography. Then down at the bottom, you see the galactosemia test during pregnancy. So this is actually a crucial part, a crucial thing for travellers to know. Travellers are more likely to carry the gene for classic galactosemia, which means that you don't have the gene can't digest the protein in milk. I think it's casein, but while it's it's a condition that can be easily lived with. If you are getting dairy products into a child, it can cause serious damage in terms of brain damage and physical development. So getting this information out into the community is of a vital importance. How we approach it is, like I said, multimodal form and different ways. We use iconography. We use very, very plain and straight to the point language, and we try our best then to kind of disseminate it through either primary work and then disseminate it through our networks then for they can share with the primary healthcare programs who will be actually out working with the communities on the ground. Next slide there, please. And then another kind of another thing we got a commendation from NALA from was for our PaveeMothers.ie, So it's another website that we have apart from our pavee.ie website, which actually follows the same thing. But as you can see there, there's a mixture of different kind of forms of communication. You know, pregnancy loss, it's there in language, but then you have the icon, mental health and well-being. You know, it's the color coding for the 3 different trimesters of pregnancy. And then, you know, it's important to remember that every woman's pregnancy is different. It's just plain, simple language that gets straight to the point. You know, it avoids jargon. You know, there's no word talk of doctors break up the pregnancy in 3 different stages. You know, we can talk about consultants, we can talk about midwives, but what's the word that everyone recognizes, and that is doctor. So it's keep the language straight to the point, I suppose. And then with that in mind, and also the time in mind, next slide, please. You know, just some considerations for good practice when you are working with marginalized communities. That is, like I said, it goes back to what we were doing. Understand the impact of racism and discrimination on children and families. Avoid one size fits all approaches. Be aware of stereotypes and prejudice and avoid them. Never, ever assume. And that goes into the next point, which is to participate in ongoing anti-racism and anti-discrimination training. And, you know, you might say, oh, we did that 5 years ago, but the context might have changed. You know, the policy context might have changed. The key issues affecting the community may have changed in that time. So that's why it should be ongoing, and that's why, you know, other things come out. Is to consider the language needs and literacy needs. Now, I didn't speak about Roma today because of the short time frame, but that is a huge one for Roma, actually. Is that actually a lot of Roma tend to have quite good levels of literacy. Their issues can come when it comes as English as a second language or English as a foreign language. So it's kind of being mindful of that. And a lot of stuff that we would do is actually get proper translation or a translation into what we're doing. Give a clear explanation of your role and processes. Like, you know, don't say, you know, I'm here, I do a bit of everything. Just know this is my job. This is specifically what I do. This is how I do it, and build that trust by being consistent with that, you know. And then and I suppose this is the key one, is to have a partnership approach with families and key stakeholders. Work with other organizations that are in your area that are doing similar work. Build a community practice, but work with the communities you want to serve. Don't work for them, or don't speak to them. Speak with them, and kind of build up and kind of find the solutions together. And I suppose that's what kind of underpins everything that we kind of set out to do. And with that, I will take questions, and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability.
That was excellent, David. Thank you so much. My God, you covered so much there, like fair play, getting it all in. It just shows, I think, again, there's a real theme of the legacy of some of the things that have happened many years ago, but they're still so relevant and have such an impact today. And just it's some great tips there on how you can apply what Pavee Point have developed over many decades in your own work. So thank you so much, David. Again, so much to Aoife and David and I know, again, preparation for things like this and everything, it's in addition to your ongoing work. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do that.